The Old Testament is still really important, even though we have the New Testament. Someone once said, you have to be a good Jew before you can be a good Christian. And that's because so much of the meaning of the Christian faith has its roots in the story of the Jewish people. A really good example is the Eucharist, the centre of Christian worship. You can't really understand what's going on in the Eucharist until you understand what's going on in the Passover. So it was in a Passover meal that Jesus said the words, "Do this in remembrance of me." The Jews were given very clear instructions never, ever, ever to eat meat with blood still in it. So you find in the Old Testament law, the blood had to be returned to the earth when an animal was slaughtered because the blood contained the life, and the life belonged to God. So the life had to be returned to God before the meat could be eaten. So when Jesus at the Last Supper picked up the cup and said, "This is my blood, drink it," they would have been aghast at that. But what he was saying would have been very clear to them as well. This is my life, take my life into yourself. Now, once you understand the Jewish background, the impact of what Jesus did at the Last Supper takes on a whole new significance. So yet, we certainly still need the Old Testament, and the two go together.
Yes, we absolutely do. Jesus only had the Old Testament. So if we're actually going to follow his example, obviously, if he read the Old Testament and saw it as relevant, then we also need to delve into the Old Testament. But it is difficult to read. And for those of us who've lived in the New Testament most of our lives, and sometimes we don't read it well. It's like we've lost the language for reading it. And I'm not talking about Hebrew here. I'm just talking about understanding how the literature works, you know, what is going on in these stories, and all the ugly bits that we struggle with, like the killing and the wishing people were dead, and all the difficult bits that you have with the Old Testament. But if we can learn to read it well, then we can see the depth that's there. Things in the New Testament do not make sense without the understanding of what God was doing in the Old Testament, and most particularly what Jesus was doing. If we don't understand what God had promised in the Old Testament, we will not understand how Jesus' death and resurrection actually works. So we need to go back to the Old Testament and look at how God dealt with people, not just the messianic prophecies, but also how God brings people back into relationship with himself and how that works. So even books like Leviticus, which list all the offerings, if you read that well, you will understand why God needed Christ to come and do what he did, because that is the beginnings of the thinking about restoration in our relationship and atonement.
And when we lose our way, well, you know we'll get there still.